It began quietly. On a sleepy cul-de-sac lined with identical beige homes and perfectly trimmed lawns, a woman named Margaret found her peace in the soil beneath her hands. Every morning before work, she crouched down by her small flower bed, humming softly as she pressed seeds into the earth. She wasn't a landscaper, not a botanist, not even an avid gardener by trade. She was just someone who loved color. The neighborhood, however, did not love color. The Homeowners Association, a board of residents who treated their bylaws like sacred scripture, prided themselves on uniformity. Every house was painted within a narrow palette of approved tones. Every lawn was mowed to the same short height, every driveway scrubbed of oil stains, and every shrub trimmed as if measured with a ruler. To them, perfection meant conformity. And then Margaret's flowers began to bloom. At first they were subtle. Soft yellow marigolds nestled against the porch. A few violet petunias spilled from hanging baskets. Neighbors walking their dogs noticed them, smiling politely but moving on. For Margaret, those blooms were small victories. Her father had passed away the year before, and he had always told her, "When life feels gray, plant something that reminds you of spring." But the real transformation came a few months later. Margaret expanded her flower beds, weaving together an explosion of color: bright red geraniums, orange zinnias, pink snapdragons, and even rare blue salvias that she had ordered online. The small corner of her yard became a tapestry of petals. People driving through the neighborhood slowed down just to look. And that was when the complaints started. The HOA president, a sharp-eyed woman named Janice, lived 3 houses down. She believed herself to be the guardian of order, a self-appointed protector of the community's image. From her window, Janice saw Margaret's flowers not as beauty, but as a threat. In her mind, one splash of color could lead to chaos. If one person planted rainbow gardens, another might paint their shutters teal, or install lawn gnomes, or, heaven forbid, leave their Christmas lights up past January. The first letter arrived in a plain envelope, slid under Margaret's door. It was short, cold, and written in the HOA's formal tone. Your front yard flower display is not in compliance with community aesthetic standards. The colors are excessively bright and disruptive to neighborhood harmony. Please remove or replace them with HOA-approved greenery within 10 days to avoid fines. Margaret read the letter twice. At first, she laughed. Too bright? How could nature itself be too bright? She left the flowers as they were. But the HOA wasn't joking. 10 days later, another letter arrived, this one stapled to a notice of a fine. $50. If she didn't remove the flowers, the fines would escalate. Margaret was stunned. For years, she had paid her dues, trimmed her hedges, followed the rules. But this was absurd. She wasn't parking a broken RV in her yard. She wasn't raising chickens or blasting loud music. She was simply planting flowers. Still, the board meetings were merciless. When she attended one to plead her case, Janice sat at the head of the table, frowning like a school principal. Other board members flipped through their papers, not meeting Margaret's eyes. The decision was final. The flowers must go. She walked home that night feeling small. Every petal in her garden seemed like a target now. Neighbors whispered. Some were supportive, telling her quietly that her flowers made the street brighter. But others, the rule followers and enforcers, shook their heads. If the HOA says they're not allowed, they muttered. Margaret considered giving in. She imagined digging up the flowers, stuffing them into trash bags, and rolling out sod to match the dull grass on every other lot. It would end the letters, the fines, the stress. She could live quietly, blending in like everyone else. But something inside her refused. Maybe it was her father's voice reminding her of spring. Maybe it was the way children stopped to point at her blooms with wonder in their eyes. Or maybe it was simply the injustice of it all, that a group of neighbors could decide beauty itself was against the rules. So instead of tearing her flowers out, Margaret planted more. That weekend, she expanded the beds across her entire front lawn. Rows of tulips, daffodils, and begonias lined the walkway. Vines of morning glories climbed her porch railing. By Monday morning, her house looked like it had been dipped in a painter's palette. The HOA erupted. Janice stormed down the street, clipboard in hand, scribbling furiously. A stack of new fines arrived within days. $100, then $200, then $500. Margaret's mailbox became a battlefield. But the more they fined her, the more determined she became. She worked long evenings, digging and planting until her knees ached and her hands blistered. Her yard became not just a garden, but a statement. Then something unexpected happened. People outside the neighborhood started noticing. A local jogger snapped a picture of Margaret's front yard and posted it online with the caption, "Brightest house on the block." The photo spread, gathering likes, comments, and shares. Soon, drivers who didn't even live there began cruising through the cul-de-sac just to see the flowers. Margaret would glance up from her watering can to find strangers rolling down their windows, waving and snapping photos. The HOA hated it. The attention felt like mockery. Their rigid, carefully controlled neighborhood was becoming famous for the very thing they despised, Margaret's defiance. But for Margaret, the attention was fuel. She wasn't backing down. If anything, she was only getting started, because this wasn't just about flowers anymore. It was about freedom, about beauty, about proving that one person could stand against a system designed to crush individuality. And as the first article about her battle with the HOA appeared in the local paper, Margaret realized something powerful. Her little garden had started a war. The article in the local paper was short, barely a few paragraphs, but it was enough. Neighborhood HOA fines woman for flowers, community divided. The headline drew attention. Some readers shook their heads in disbelief. How could anyone fine a woman for planting flowers? Others, particularly those who loved their own neighborhoods neat and beige, quietly nodded in agreement. But for Margaret, the impact was immediate. The story spread beyond her cul-de-sac, reaching nearby communities. Curious strangers began driving past her house, pulling over to take photos of her blooming yard. Some even left small notes of encouragement on her porch. A retired teacher wrote, "Thank you for bringing color to our world." A group of children drew crayon pictures of her garden and taped them to her door. To outsiders, Margaret was becoming a symbol of beauty and resilience. To the HOA, she was becoming their greatest problem. The fines escalated faster than ever. Every week, envelopes stuffed with violation notices appeared in her mailbox. $500 became $700, then $1,000. The HOA claimed her flowers were aesthetic violations, disruptive to community harmony, even a potential safety hazard, because they might distract drivers. Margaret laughed bitterly at that one. Distract drivers? Wasn't that the same as saying joy itself was dangerous? Still, the pressure weighed heavily on her. Each fine was a reminder that the HOA wasn't going to stop. Margaret wasn't wealthy. She worked a modest office job, lived alone, and budgeted carefully. Paying these fines was out of the question, and if she ignored them, the HOA had the power to place liens on her home, even threaten foreclosure. For the first time, fear crept in, but fear was quickly replaced with resolve. Margaret realized she needed to be strategic. She couldn't just plant flowers and hope for the best. She had to fight back on their terms, legally, publicly, and loudly. So she began researching. Nights that once belonged to gardening were now spent at her kitchen table, laptop glowing as she scrolled through legal codes and state property laws. She discovered something fascinating. While HOAs had broad power, they were not limitless. In fact, many states had strict laws protecting homeowners from HOA overreach. And among those laws were provisions for freedom of expression, including landscaping choices. Her flowers might not just be beautiful, they might actually be protected. But Margaret didn't stop there. She reached out to gardening clubs, community groups, even local activists. She told her story on online forums where people shared horror stories about overzealous HOAs. Each time she posted, the responses multiplied. Strangers across the country rallied behind her, calling her brave, sending her gardening tips, and even offering to donate plants to expand her project. Meanwhile, inside the neighborhood, the battle lines were being drawn. Some neighbors admired her courage. They stopped pretending indifference and openly expressed their support. A few even began planting flowers of their own. Tiny splashes of color here and there, small acts of rebellion. For the first time, the cul-de-sac looked less uniform, more alive. But others stood firmly with the HOA. They complained loudly at meetings that Margaret was ruining property values. They muttered about troublemakers and outsiders driving through. Janice, the HOA president, fueled the anger, portraying Margaret as selfish and reckless, someone who thought she was above the rules. Tension spread like wildfire. What had once been a quiet neighborhood became a battlefield of opinions. Sidewalk conversations turned into arguments. Neighbors who had once waved politely now avoided eye contact, glaring across lawns. And Margaret stood at the center of it all, her yard a glowing banner of defiance. Then came the unthinkable. The HOA sent her a final notice. If she did not remove the flowers within 30 days, they would pursue legal action and file a lien against her property. It was a direct threat to her home. Margaret's heart pounded as she read the letter. Losing her home was her greatest fear. She couldn't let it happen. Not after pouring so much love and labor into her garden. Not after finding herself in the fight of her life. So she made a decision. If the HOA wanted war, she would give them war. But not with anger, not with destruction. She would fight them with the very thing they hated most. Flowers. She doubled down. Margaret transformed her yard into something extraordinary. She expanded every flower bed, creating sweeping arcs of color. She built raised planters, filled them with exotic blooms that few in the neighborhood had ever seen. She arranged pathways lined with blossoms that glowed in the evening sun. Her house became a canvas, her garden the paint. Word spread faster than ever. Local news stations showed up with cameras, broadcasting live segments about the woman who fought her HOA with flowers. Social media lit up. Hashtags began trending. Number let her bloom, number fight the HOA, number color not conformity. Supporters came in droves, some even offering to help her plant. Cars lined the street as visitors brought their own flowers, adding them to her yard as a gesture of solidarity. Children pressed seeds into the soil beside her. Retirees brought cuttings from their gardens. Within weeks, Margaret's yard was no longer just hers. It was a living community project. And that was when the HOA realized they had lost control. What had started as a single woman's defiance had grown into something much bigger. A movement. But Margaret also knew this story was far from over. The HOA wasn't going to back down quietly. Janice's pride wouldn't allow it. Legal threats loomed, neighbors bickered, and the future of her home still hung in the balance. Yet as Margaret stood on her porch one golden evening, watching the sunlight dance across thousands of petals, she felt something powerful stir inside her. For the first time in her life, she wasn't just planting flowers, she was planting change. And change, once it takes root, cannot be stopped. The 30 days passed quickly, and when Margaret refused to uproot her flowers, the HOA made good on their threat. One morning, a thick envelope arrived in her mailbox. Inside was a stack of legal documents, pages upon pages of formal accusations, citations of bylaws, and a notice that the HOA intended to pursue a lien against her property. It wasn't just about fines anymore. If she lost, she could lose her home. For a moment, Margaret felt her knees weaken. She sat at her kitchen table staring at the papers, her garden glowing brightly just beyond the window. The stakes had never been higher, but she wasn't the same woman who had first received that petty too bright notice weeks ago. She wasn't afraid anymore. She was ready. Margaret hired a lawyer, Not just any lawyer, she found one who specialized in property rights and HOA disputes. His name was Robert, a quiet man with graying hair who had spent years watching HOAs abuse their authority. When he saw her case, his eyes lit up. He told Margaret what she had already begun to suspect. The HOA had overstepped. State law was on her side. Together, they prepared for battle. The case quickly drew attention. Local news outlets had already been covering her story, and when word spread that it was headed to court, reporters camped outside the courthouse. Supporters gathered with signs reading, "Let her flowers bloom and stop HOA bullies." Margaret, who had once felt invisible, now walked through crowds of cheering strangers who called her brave. The courtroom itself was tense. On one side sat Margaret and her lawyer, calm but determined. On the other sat Janice and the HOA board dressed stiffly, their faces tight with disdain. Janice clutched a binder overflowing with rules and regulations, convinced that her authority would triumph. But authority crumbles when it collides with truth. Margaret's lawyer laid out the facts. He cited state statutes protecting homeowners from arbitrary aesthetic restrictions. He argued that flowers, natural, harmless, and beneficial to pollinators, could not reasonably be classified as disruptive. He presented photos of Margaret's garden, not as an eyesore but as a vibrant work of art. Then came the testimonies. Neighbors who supported Margaret took the stand, speaking about how her flowers brightened their days, how children loved walking past her house, how strangers came from miles away just to see the beauty she had created. When it was the HOA's turn, their case began to unravel. Their arguments sounded petty in contrast. Claims that the flowers were too bright, lowered property values, and distracted drivers. The judge's expression hardened with each weak excuse. By the time Janice insisted that Margaret's yard threatened the community's sense of order, the courtroom was nearly stifling with suppressed laughter. It became clear. The HOA wasn't protecting the neighborhood. They were protecting their power. And power without reason holds no weight in court. After hours of testimony and arguments, the judge finally delivered the verdict. The HOA's fines were deemed excessive and unlawful. Their attempt to place a lien on Margaret's home was struck down. Furthermore, the court ordered the HOA to reimburse Margaret for legal fees. In that single moment, the weight of fear lifted from her shoulders. Margaret had not only saved her home, she had won a victory for every homeowner who had ever been bullied by an overreaching HOA. Outside the courthouse, supporters erupted in cheers. Reporters swarmed her, cameras flashing as she stood beside her lawyer. Margaret, exhausted but radiant, thanked everyone who had stood by her. She didn't see herself as a hero, but to those watching, she was exactly that. The victory should have ended the war, but wars rarely end neatly. Back in the neighborhood, resentment festered. The HOA had been humiliated, their authority publicly dismantled. Some board members wanted to quietly move on, but Janice wasn't ready to concede defeat. Her pride burned too brightly. If she couldn't stop Margaret through fines or the courts, she would find another way. And in the days that followed, subtle acts of hostility began to appear. Her garden hose was mysteriously cut one night, water pooling across the lawn. A delivery of plants she ordered went missing from her porch. Someone dumped lawn clippings over her flower beds. These acts weren't accidents, they were petty attempts at intimidation. Margaret refused to be rattled. She cleaned up the mess, replaced the hose, and kept planting. But she knew what was happening. Janice was angry, and anger makes people reckless. At the same time, something extraordinary was happening outside the neighborhood. Margaret's story had gone viral. National news outlets picked it up. Gardening blogs, lifestyle magazines, and even evening television programs covered the woman who defeated her HOA with flowers. Her home address, once just another line in a subdivision, became a landmark. Visitors arrived daily, walking along the street to admire the blooms. Some even left gifts, bags of seeds, potted plants, gardening tools. What had begun as a solitary act of defiance had become a movement of thousands. But Margaret also understood the danger of her growing fame. The more attention she received, the more determined her enemies would become. Janice had already shown she would stop at nothing to regain control. And if the petty sabotage continued to escalate, Margaret worried that something far worse might be coming. Still, as she stood on her porch one evening, looking out over a garden that now covered every inch of her yard in waves of color, she felt a deep, steady confidence. She had faced the HOA in court and won. She had faced fines, humiliation, and threats, yet her garden only grew stronger. And deep down, she knew one thing for certain. Janice might fight harder, but Margaret was prepared to fight hardest of all. Because flowers don't just bloom once, they return, season after season, stronger every time, and so would she. Victory in court should have been the end. For most people, defeating the HOA's threats, securing their home, and being reimbursed for legal costs would have been enough. But Margaret was not most people. She had tasted both injustice and triumph, and she understood something the HOA did not. Once seeds of defiance are planted, they spread. The court's ruling had humiliated the board, but it had also exposed them. Neighbors whispered about their misuse of authority. Local news reporters dug deeper into the HOA's history, uncovering patterns of excessive fines, selective enforcement, and favoritism toward certain board members. What had once been seen as strict order now looked suspiciously like abuse of power. For Janice, the HOA president, this was intolerable. She had built her identity on control. Every rule enforced, every lawn identical, every flowerbed plain. Margaret's victory wasn't just a defeat in court, it was a personal humiliation. And humiliation has a way of festering into obsession. The sabotage grew bolder. It started with small acts. Margaret's hose cut, flowers trampled overnight, packages stolen from her porch. At first, she chalked it up to childish spite, but then came more deliberate attacks. One morning she woke to find her mailbox ripped from the ground. Another time someone sprayed herbicide across part of her lawn, leaving a brown scar among the blooms. Each act was meant to break her spirit, to force her to give up the garden she had fought so hard to defend. But instead of breaking, Margaret grew more determined. She replaced the mailbox with one painted in bright floral designs. She replanted every damaged bed twice as full. She even installed cameras, not just to catch the culprits, but to document every act of hostility. The footage she captured was damning. Neighbors saw figures moving in the dark, faces obscured but silhouettes that looked familiar. Though Janice denied any involvement, the resemblance was too close for comfort. When Margaret posted clips online, the videos spread quickly. Supporters flooded the comment sections with outrage, while strangers offered to send her security lights, fences, even donations to keep her garden safe. What the HOA had failed to grasp was that every act of sabotage only deepened public sympathy for Margaret. Far from silencing her, they had turned her into a symbol of resistance. Meanwhile, inside the neighborhood, something unexpected was happening. Margaret's defiance had sparked a quiet rebellion. More and more residents began planting flowers of their own. At first, it was just a few pots of daisies on porches or a row of tulips along a walkway. But soon, entire lawns began to bloom. It started with her next-door neighbor, an elderly widow who said Margaret's garden reminded her of the countryside where she grew up. Then a young family across the street added bright sunflowers, their children laughing as they watered them each morning. One by one, houses that had once looked identical began to sprout with color. The neighborhood, once uniform and beige, was changing. And Janice could only watch in horror as the order she had spent years maintaining unraveled. She called emergency HOA meetings, urging compliance, warning of fines. But residents, emboldened by Margaret's victory, began to push back. Some openly questioned the board's authority. Others simply ignored them, planting whatever they pleased. For the first time, Janice's power was slipping. But Margaret's influence wasn't just limited to her street. With every news segment, every viral photo, her garden drew more visitors. Entire families drove from other towns to see it. Garden clubs asked her to speak at their events. Even local schools brought children on field trips, teaching them about plants, pollinators, and the power of community. What began as one woman's private refuge had become a public movement. Her home, once ordinary, was now a landmark. And yet, even as she stood in her garden each evening, surrounded by waves of color and the hum of bees, Margaret knew the fight wasn't over. Janice's bitterness had not disappeared. It was growing, tightening like a fist. The breaking point came one hot summer night. Margaret woke to the sharp scent of smoke. Heart pounding, she rushed to the window and saw a small fire smoldering at the edge of her yard. Someone had tossed a lit match or cigarette into her mulch bed, hoping it would catch. The flames licked upward, threatening to spread. She grabbed her hose, spraying furiously until the fire died. Ash clung to her hands, her breath ragged as she stared at the blackened patch of earth. This wasn't vandalism anymore. It was danger. Whoever was behind this had crossed a line. The next morning, she didn't post about it online. She didn't call the HOA. She went directly to the police. The investigation began quietly, but Margaret had learned to be patient. She handed over her security footage, reported every act of harassment, and refused to be intimidated. For weeks, nothing happened. But when the police finally knocked on her door with an update, she wasn't surprised by the name they mentioned. Janice. Though charges were still pending and evidence was being reviewed, the suspicion was clear. Neighbors murmured, reporters circled, and Janice's once fearsome reputation began to collapse. Margaret didn't rejoice, she didn't gloat, she simply kept planting. Because for her, the garden was no longer just about defiance. It was about renewal, about proving that beauty could survive even in the harshest conditions. Every flower that bloomed from scorched soil was a reminder. Resilience is stronger than control. But Margaret also knew this story was not over. The HOA still existed. The bylaws still gave them power. And Janice, even if disgraced, would not give up quietly. The war between conformity and color had entered a new phase, and Margaret was ready. By midsummer, Margaret's yard was no longer just a patch of color. It was a living masterpiece. What began as a rebellion against one HOA letter had grown into an unstoppable force. Entire swaths of her lawn were now oceans of blossoms. Roses climbed trellises, lavender perfumed the air, lilies stretched tall against the porch. Butterflies fluttered like living jewels. Bees hummed, drifting lazily from bloom to bloom. The once quiet cul-de-sac now looked like the entrance to a botanical garden. But Margaret's flowers weren't just drawing attention locally anymore, they were drawing attention everywhere. News stations that had once treated her as a quirky human interest story were now dedicating full segments to her. A popular gardening magazine featured her on its cover under the headline, "The Woman Who Bloomed Against the HOA." Bloggers wrote about her resilience. Podcasts interviewed her about fighting authority, and her photos spread across every corner of social media. The movement had grown beyond her control. Hashtags like number BLOOMREBELLION and number COLORVERCONFORMITY trended across platforms. People hundreds of miles away sent photos of their own Margaret gardens, small patches of defiance against restrictive HOAs. It wasn't just about flowers anymore, it was about standing up to unnecessary control. And as Margaret's name grew, the pressure on her HOA exploded. Reporters began investigating not only Janice, but the entire board. They uncovered stories from other homeowners who had been fined for absurd reasons. One for hanging wind chimes, another for having a front door painted slightly too red, and yet another for letting children draw chalk art on their driveway. The narrative shifted. This wasn't about one woman's flowers, it was about HOA overreach everywhere. Margaret watched all of this with quiet amazement. She had never asked for fame. She had never imagined that her simple act of planting flowers would resonate with thousands. But she also understood the responsibility that came with it. People were looking to her for hope, and so she leaned into it. Instead of hiding from the cameras, she opened her yard to visitors. She welcomed families, answered questions, and encouraged others to plant what made them happy. On weekends, her home became a gathering place. Parents brought their children to see the garden that beat the HOA. Gardening clubs organized meetups there. Strangers left behind handwritten notes. "You gave me courage to stand up for myself." The HOA, meanwhile, was unraveling. Janice's name had become infamous. Once feared, she was now ridiculed across social media. People called her the flower police, mocking her obsession with beige lawns and conformity. Even within the board, cracks began to form. Members who once blindly supported her started resigning, unwilling to face public scorn. But Janice was not someone who surrendered easily. With her reputation on the line, she doubled down. She insisted Margaret was manipulating the media and destroying neighborhood harmony. She drafted new proposals for stricter landscaping rules, desperate to claw back control. But when those proposals were presented at community meetings, residents openly laughed. The power she had clung to for years was slipping through her fingers, and Margaret's influence only grew stronger. She launched a small website called Bloom Freely, where homeowners could share their stories of standing up against unfair HOA rules. Within weeks, hundreds of submissions poured in. Photos of painted fences, handmade decorations, gardens bursting with color. It became a digital archive of defiance. Even lawmakers began to take notice. State officials hinted at reviewing legislation to prevent HOAs from abusing power, citing Margaret's case as an example. Her battle, once confined to one cul-de-sac, was now sparking real conversations about property rights across the state. Through it all, Margaret remained humble. She still spent her mornings in the garden, kneeling in the dirt, hands stained with soil. Fame hadn't changed her routine. She wasn't chasing recognition, she was chasing peace. Every new flower she planted reminded her of why she had started, her father's words about bringing spring into gray days. But she could not ignore the storm brewing in the background. Because while her supporters multiplied, Janice's bitterness deepened. And bitterness, when cornered, is dangerous. Margaret knew the sabotage could return. She knew there was still a possibility that the HOA might attempt one last desperate strike. Something louder, something destructive. And she was right. Late one evening, as the sky burned orange with sunset, Margaret noticed something strange. A group of cars idled at the end of the street. Their headlights flickered, engines rumbling. Figures stepped out, whispering to each other, glancing toward her house. At first, she thought it was just visitors, more curious onlookers. But as the figures moved closer, she realized these weren't supporters. They were angry residents loyal to Janice, furious that their once quiet neighborhood had become a tourist attraction. They muttered about traffic, about noise, about how their property values were plummeting because of the attention. They pointed at her house, their voices rising. Margaret's heart pounded. For the first time, she felt unsafe in her own yard. She backed toward her porch, clutching her phone. But before she could call anyone, something unexpected happened. Neighbors, those who supported her, began to emerge from their houses. One by one, families stepped outside. The widow next door, the young couple with sunflowers, the children who loved watering plants. They stood silently between Margaret's home and the angry group. They didn't shout, they didn't threaten. They simply stood there, united, as if forming a human fence. The angry residents hesitated. Their numbers were fewer than they realized. And as more supporters arrived, drawn by the commotion, by loyalty to Margaret, the confrontation fizzled. The angry group retreated, grumbling as they climbed back into their cars. Margaret stood on her porch, stunned. For the first time, she realized this fight was no longer hers alone. She had planted the first seed, but now the garden had grown roots deep into her community. The HOA could fine her, sabotage her, even threaten her in court. But they couldn't erase what had already bloomed. The neighborhood itself was changing, and there was no going back. The standoff on the street marked a turning point. For months, Margaret had carried the weight of the fight alone, against fines, against sabotage, against an HOA president who seemed determined to crush her spirit. But as her neighbors stood between her home and hostility, she realized something important. This was no longer just her battle. The community itself had shifted. What began as whispers of support had grown into open defiance. Residents who once feared fines now planted boldly, their lawns alive with tulips, roses, and wildflowers. The neighborhood, once a sterile grid of beige conformity, was slowly becoming a patchwork of individuality. Each new bloom was an act of quiet rebellion, proof that Margaret's courage had spread like seeds on the wind. And the HOA could no longer control it. Membership dropped as homeowners stopped attending meetings. Fines went unpaid, rules went ignored, and those still loyal to Janice found themselves outnumbered. What had once been a board feared for its authority was now mocked for its impotence. But Janice herself refused to let go. Her pride, wounded by Margaret's victory and humiliated by national attention, turned desperate. She called emergency meetings, drafted furious newsletters, even hired an attorney of her own to threaten new lawsuits. Yet each effort fell flat. Her words carried no weight anymore. Even the board members who remained began to distance themselves, unwilling to sync with her. The final collapse came quietly, but decisively. Under pressure from both residents and outside scrutiny, the HOA was forced to hold a community-wide vote on its leadership. It was the first time in years that ordinary homeowners had a real say in who governed them. When the ballots were counted, the result was undeniable, and Janice was out. Not only was she removed as president, but her entire board was replaced by new members. Neighbors who had stood on Margaret's lawn that night, neighbors who believed rules should protect, not punish. For Janice, it was the ultimate humiliation. The woman who once ruled over every lawn, every hedge, every flower, now had no authority at all. Her reign ended not with a final confrontation, but with silence, her power evaporating as quickly as it had once seemed absolute. For Margaret, the news was both relief and closure. She hadn't set out to destroy Janice nor to dismantle the HOA. All she had ever wanted was to plant flowers in peace. Yet, in defending her garden, she had toppled a system built on control. And the legacy of her fight stretched far beyond her own street. Her story continued to ripple outward. Homeowners in other towns cited her case when pushing back against unfair fines. Lawmakers proposed bills curbing HOA overreach, some even calling it the Margaret Law. Her website, Bloom Freely, grew into a thriving community where people shared victories, advice, and photos of their own colorful yards. Margaret had become something she never expected, a symbol of resistance, a voice for those who felt powerless. But fame never changed her heart. She still rose early, hands in the dirt, tending her flowers as she always had. She still hummed softly as she watered each bed, pausing to admire the bees and butterflies that had made her garden their home. And though visitors still came, families, students, gardeners from miles away, she welcomed them not as fans but as friends. Her garden had always been about sharing beauty, and now it belonged to everyone. As summer turned to autumn, the neighborhood transformed once more. What had once been a battleground of conformity and color was now a place of balance. Yards bloomed with variety, some with wildflowers spilling across fences, others with neat rows of roses, others still with nothing more than simple shrubs. No one was fined, no one was punished. For the first time, homeowners felt free to choose what made them happy. And Margaret's house stood at the center of it all, a living reminder of what one person's defiance could achieve. Sometimes on quiet evenings she thought of her father. She remembered his words. When life feels gray, plant something that reminds you of spring. She realized now that he had given her more than advice. He had given her the foundation for everything she had built. Not just a garden, but a legacy. One night, as the sun sank low and painted the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Margaret walked her garden path. The air was heavy with the scent of jasmine and roses. Fireflies winked among the blooms. She paused at the center where once a patch of scorched earth had marked someone's attempt to destroy her work. Now, in its place, a bed of lilies glowed softly in the twilight. Resilience blooming from ashes. She smiled, knowing that no matter what came next, no matter what rules or obstacles the world tried to impose, this garden, this legacy, would endure. Because flowers cannot be silenced, and neither can the spirit of someone who dares to plant them.